Good morning. My name is Maurice Villaroel, and today I'd like to talk about operational welfare indicators and about some results from a recent project called FishWell that talks about operational welfare indicators. So I've been involved with fish welfare for a while. I was involved in the Cost Action 867 Welfare of Fish in European Aquaculture, which was coordinated by Anders Kiesling from Sweden, and that lasted from 2005 to 2011. And then more recently, in a project called WinFish, Welfare, Health and Individuality in Farm Fish, which was coordinated by Manuel Gesto, who's also Spanish but lives and works in Denmark. That was more involving, well, several different species and how kind of fish personality is involved with welfare. Also, over the years, since about 2004, I've also been involved in different national projects that have to do with fish welfare, mostly pre-slaughter handling and the effect of fasting. Mostly on trout, although we have worked on sea bass and sea bream. That's my Twitter feed and that's my blog. And this is just a small, this is just a screenshot of some abstracts, well, the abstracts from the conference we had, which was the final conference of the Cost Fish Welfare Project. And that was held in Madrid, here in Agrónomos, in the Agriculture Engineering faculty. So this talk is about 10-15 minutes, and what we're going to talk about is operational welfare indicators. We're going to define them. What are the objectives of the Fish Well project? 3 different types of indicators or operational welfare indicators that are suggested by the Fish Well project, if they could be applicable to other species, and some conclusions. What is an operational welfare indicator? Well, in the WellFish project, which was the real name of the Cost Action project, not to be confused with the Fish Well project, we defined some operational welfare indicators, and this is in a publication by Hans van de Vis. So I will get out of the screen here for a second. In the Fish Well project, operational welfare indicators are defined as measurements or assessments of welfare that can be made practically at a commercial aquaculture facilities. That's opposed to biological measures of welfare that are often not practical or suitable for use at a commercial aquaculture facility. This was published by Van de Vis in a paper in Fish Physiology and Biochemistry, and this is where we published in this journal all the papers that came out of that Fish Well project. So this is from a series of papers. Really, operational welfare indicators the idea is simple, but it's harder than you think to actually develop. So on the one side you have over here science, fundamental research. We've been working for years, decades, on things related to fish and welfare and behavior. On the other side you have the industry, who are working day by day to keep the fish alive, to keep the fish growing, and they could do more what we call apply research. The thing is, they have to make daily decisions about what's going on with their fish. So if they see the fish aren't eating properly, if they say some of the fish are emaciated, they have to take decisions. So what science wants to do is talk to the industry. So we have science speaking to the industry and saying, how do you make those decisions, and are the indicators you're using valid? In the long term, in the short term, are they valid across different aquaculture facilities, for example? Maybe they're only good for one place, and then in that case they can't be generalized, etc. So this is also, this handbook and kind of what we did in the fish welfare, in the COST project, has several stages. So the first stage has more or less been done. Provide a toolbox, and as they say in the Fish Well handbook, find the best indicators and where and when to measure them. So we'll talk about that a bit later. Where, so different production systems, and when, during different processes. Then there could be a second stage, consensus with consumers, with administration, with people involved in working on farms, about what is an acceptable level and what is unacceptable. For example, a mortality level of 20% could be unacceptable, but a mortality level of around 1 or 2% could be acceptable. And then there could be a third stage where you refine the tools And you get together with everybody and you develop protocols and standards which more or less make sure that the aquaculture is working correctly and the fish have good welfare. I'd like to say that in the Fish Welfare Handbook, I was not directly involved with the developing the handbook, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it was funded by NOFEMA and was involved a whole series of Norwegian institutes and one from Scotland, University of Stirling, which is specialized in aquaculture. So although I wasn't directly involved, this is kind of like a review of what they've been up to. The Fish Welfare Handbook has 3 parts. I must say it's kind of long, 350 pages, 351 pages long. This is I'm standing in front of the title page. There we have some salmon. So this is just about salmon, even though it says fish well. So it's like Salmon Well Handbook. The first part is a review of knowledge and theory. It's about 140 pages, which makes up kind of most of the book. So they talk about the welfare needs of fish, and they divide indicators into what is a more animal-based and what is more environment-based. The second part, it's all together in the same thing, but it's like a second book, are operational welfare indicators and production systems. So using the welfare indicators that they talked about at the beginning in part A, they go through and say which ones are good for flow-through systems, for recirculation aquaculture systems, for sea cages, etc. Then in the part C, they look at not production system, but routines within the production system. So we're talking about crowding, for example. When you're crowding the fish, are there moments during that kind of short period, which operational welfare indicators are the best? Slaughter and grading, to name just a few. Then they go on to say, and this has been done before, that there are 3 main types of operational welfare indicators. Environmentally based, in this handbook they mention 8 that are related to water quality and 3 rearing in practice. And then there are also 2 more, animals, but based on groups or based on individuals. So there are 8 group indicators and 23 individual indicators. So we have a bit more bias towards individuals because actually we're worried about individual animal welfare. And the external are more where you can see, where you go into the farm, you can see from a distance, so you don't necessarily have to touch the animals. And the individuals are more external appearance, where normally you should manipulate the animals. So we'll look into these a bit further. This is a kind of a hard slide to see, but it's easier to read when you're reading the handbook. And I don't expect you to read it, but here we just see, basically we have the environmental ones, the group-based animal welfare indicators, the individual ones, and then we have blood and muscle, which are more laboratory ones, okay? So I don't expect you to read this, but you can find it on page 109 of the handbook, which you can download for free on the internet. But talking a bit more then about what's happening with those indicators in detail, you don't get a real sense from the handbook itself which are more important. But I've done a little trick, I guess, where I just basically counted the words that the authors dedicate to describing that indicator, which gives a kind of an indirect indication of how important it is. In environmental indicators, we can see there's not much of a difference. I'll get it on the screen here. So we have 8: temperature, salinity, oxygen, CO2, pH, total ammonia, nitrogen, nitrate, and turbidity. So these would be 8 indicators for environment, which they consider operational welfare indicators. So if we're measuring these and they're within correct ranges, the fish should be more or less within a good welfare, have more or less good welfare. So they talk a little bit less, about salinity, and the other ones, temperature, CO2, have a more or less a similar kind of text that they talk about. It's important to point out that they've spent a lot of work here, the authors, on not only describing what temperature is, how to measure it, how good it is as a welfare, so the weaknesses and the strengths as well about how good it is as an indicator of welfare. Moving on to the group, there are also 8. So we have here mortality, behavior, appetite, growth, disease, scales in the water or blood in the water, oxygen uptake, and surface activity. So here we are using those as indicators of fish welfare that we can see kind of from a distance. Behavior is all grouped into one, but we can see there's a lot more information because there are 3 or 4 tables about different diseases that can occur in salmon production systems. And then, so let's say the disease has more information here. And you could say, well, maybe in that aspect, they're giving it more importance on a group level as a group OIE. And then second would be, for example, behavior, appetite, and maybe a bit less the scales in the water. And behavior is all grouped into one. I must say behavior, there aren't any specific indicators of behavior that they mention. And there is a problem with the behavior, which I think they've developed, and it should be underlined as far as one person observing behavior from a distance, it kind of depends on the observer. So in other words, if I feed the fish and they are feeding voraciously, that adjective may not be the same for everybody. A farmer might find it normal and I might find it abnormal, or the opposite. So as far as looking at behavior, I think the authors here in the Fish Well Handbook are kind of cautious. And in the individuals, we said there were 23. I've kind of grouped up the lab ones and the other ones, but this is the for importance. And the most important one, as far as the text is concerned, would be mucus. Mucus on the skin of the fish is being used more as an indicator of welfare, although that's more of a laboratory type because you need expertise to analyze everything that's going on in the mucus. And the authors spend a lot of time talking about it. There are other ones like vaccine-related diseases, cortisol, sea lice, eye damage, or starting from the top, gill beat, emaciation. Ionic composition, that would be in plasma, so that would be more a laboratory type of indicator. And then going on, hematocrit, abdominal organs, condition factors, sexual maturity. So you can see there's a variety there of different individual animal welfare indicators, which some have to do with just observing the fish to see, for example, vertebral deformities, the gills. Some have to do with slaughtering the fish, opening the fish and seeing abdominal organs, and some have to do with scraping, for example, mucus and sending those to a lab to evaluate. And they've gone to a lot of time an effort to provide different photos of different external injuries. For example, here we have eye hemorrhages and exophthalmia, and this is kind of the only time in the handbook where they talk about different scores. So this is 1, 2, 3 level of severity. So here, if I can point to it, there. This is the kind of a red eye here. We can see that's like a severe hemorrhage. This is a hemorrhage that's beginning, and this would be more or less minor hemorrhages over here. So next, exophthalmia, something similar. So right, and then we're going to finage damage, where we can also see the same thing. So most of the fin remains on the dorsal fin, very little fin erosion, etc. So you can find these tables and photos, which I think are very useful in the handbook. So what about operational welfare indicators in other species? Well, as far as I understand, the Fish Well group is looking at trout. So after they finish the salmon, they're now doing trout, which is also important in the north. But in the Mediterranean, where I'm speaking to you from Spain, there's been less done in general. Hans van de Vis, in the same paper I mentioned before, speaks about some operational welfare indicators for eel, African catfish, and sea bass. And sea bass, as you know, is produced in the Mediterranean. And this is the paper, so that would be more of an operational one. But if we look in general at the science, there's a lot less in sea bass and sea bream and some Mediterranean species and even carp than there is in salmon. So how far away could we be from a handbook? I just did kind of a little other analysis where if I look at the Web of Science, which has the biggest database of all the scientific publications in the world, in salmon welfare, if I put salmon welfare and cortisol as keywords in the Web of Science, I get 136 studies. If I put sea bream and welfare and cortisol, I got 27 studies. So that's about 5 times less. If I put salmon welfare in gills, I get about 50 studies, and sea bream welfare and gills about 7 studies. So, I don't know, we could estimate maybe, but there's still a number of years left before we get to the similar amount of studies in salmon on which we can base the animal welfare indicators and then kind of speak to the industry about it. Or, as we will see a bit now, there can be a bottom-up approach where there may be more applied research in sea bream and sea bass which we don't know too much about, and they can provide or mention some of the welfare indicators that they use. One of the things I like to bring up is that I don't know of any studies that really show have really analyzed and quantified the usefulness of operational welfare indicators. So I think we need more studies where we have before and after. So this would be a situation where there could be farms that are not using operational welfare indicators right now, and then we could go to that farm and then measure their fish welfare and then say, please use these operational welfare indicators, and then see how the welfare is afterwards. So we can really prove and say, well, operational welfare indicators or using these techniques is actually helpful for the fish. As far as using operational welfare indicators in other species, in sea bass and sea bream, for example, we need more industrial collaboration. So that involves not only data, but we need photos like we see, the photo scheme. We need consensus with the operators. And usually that takes a long time, and there has to be a lot of, how do you say, the trustworthiness between the two parties. And before maybe saying to the industry, you need to use these operational welfare indicators, they are probably using some indicators which they don't necessarily tie directly to welfare, but are related to welfare, and they have to do with other quality schemes. For example, critical control points, or maybe they have schemes that have to do with food quality. So we could tie in operational welfare indicators with other quality schemes as well. So as the last slide, I just want to say that this is a three-stage process, as I mentioned before. If we're looking to do this with other species, we have to do what they did in Norway, find the best indicators and where, when to measure. There needs to be consensus on what's acceptable and unacceptable. This could be done in different ways. We could group the different parties, in this case science and industry, together and ask, or we could also involve consumers and administration. As Dan Weary has done in Canada, we could do this virtually with like town hall kind of virtual environments where they could, all these different people could come together and talk online and express their worries or express how they feel about these different operational welfare indicators. And then of course there would be refining tools, developing protocols, and that will probably involve training new people, educating students, educating new technicians, and the consumers about the good job that we're doing to help to improve and maintain fish welfare in aquaculture. Thank you very much.